Hello and welcome to Accelerating Your Authority. I'm your host, Alastair McDermott, and I interview leaders, consultants, and experts about their business so they can share their stories, advice, and insights for growth. Today, I'm delighted to say that my guest is Tim Gaiser. Tim is a Master Sommelier. He is an internationally renowned wine expert. He's an educator, a writer, and a blogger. He is one of less than 300 Master Sommeliers in the world. Tim, I just want to say I love talking with you about your business, and I know that you have written a lot about this. We actually share a publisher, and that's how I know you. Can you explain what a Master Sommelier is?
Sure, Alastair. First, thanks for having me. So there are two international titles for wine. One of them is the Master of Wine, which has existed, I think, since the early 50s. And Masters of Wine, I think there are about 500 of them in the history of the organization. They focus on knowledge of winemaking and viticulture, grape growing. And also, though, they focus on writing. So they tend to be journalists, but also people who consult with, winemakers and or vineyard owners. And the Master Sommelier is the other title. The first exam was given in 1969. It has to do with the hospitality business. So Master sommelier is the French term for wine steward, and technically someone who's running a beverage program in a restaurant, and someone you would also see working the floor with a wine list and working with guests at the table to make sure that they get the right bottle of wine and have a great dining experience.
So can you tell me about your journey to becoming a Master Sommelier?
Sure. Everybody's journey into wine is different because everybody's background, of course, is different. I have lots of friends who are in the business and colleagues who are master sommeliers who came to wine from a performing arts or theater arts background and liberal arts too. My background is similar to that. I have 2 degrees in music. So I played the trumpet from the time I was in 4th grade all the way to I was 38 or 39. And I have 2 degrees, BA in music history and then a master's in classical trumpet from the University of Michigan. At the same time, my first job was working in a restaurant, literally bussing tables at a pancake house from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. on weekends, so I could make money to buy my first professional trumpet. That was in high school. And I worked in and out of restaurants literally through high school into undergrad days and then to graduate school. And then while at Michigan, living in Ann Arbor, I worked at 2 really good restaurants. I bartended at 2 restaurants that had really good wine programs, and I got bitten by the wine bug. And so when my wife Carla and I moved to San Francisco in 1984, I freelanced as a classical trumpet player, not ever making very much money. But, I got to do a lot of playing with the opera orchestra there for the first few years we were there. But at the same time, again, I mentioned I didn't make much money doing it. And so the fallback was the restaurant business. And I went back to bartending. And then bartending over time became wine buying, and that became sommelier, working the floor as a sommelier. And then in 1992, I passed the last exam for the Master Sommelier accreditation. And I was one of 3 people, all 3 of us in my tasting group in San Francisco, who passed in the U.S. that year. And so, I passed the MS exam, and from there worked in the restaurant a little bit more, but then, reached out and started working with a winery and then an online wine retailer. And then eventually I became an independent consultant contractor in the industry. And at the same time was the education chair and director for the court. So I came in sideways to the business from being a musician. And that's not uncommon. So,
Fascinating kind of background. Is there a connection for you between music and wine?
Well, there is. With music, it has to do with senses. And in the case of being a musician, it's obviously auditory, plus you're playing, which is kinesthetic. But at the same time, sitting in the back of an orchestra, if you're playing a big piece like a Mahler Symphony or the Verdi Requiem or something, you literally have hundreds of people on stage with you. And so it's your sensory acuity, you're calibrating your auditory has to be really refined to a high degree, but also your ability to do what you do at the unconscious mastery level has to be there. I mean, you can't consciously think about having to be playing in an orchestra of 100 people with 200 people singing behind you And then from moment to moment, adjusting your timbre and your sound and trying to match everyone else in your section in the orchestra and paying attention to the conductor, supposedly. And how that maps over to wine is that, with tasting, that's, primarily olfactory, but it's also taste, and then it's kinesthetic in terms of what you feel on your palate. But it's taking those things and elevating them and calibrating them to a really high degree. And so being able to shut the world out, doing both things and focused intensely in the moment in what you're doing, those two things are exactly the same. And then being able to calibrate sensory learning and memory is also, I think, really similar.
I suppose that must really help as well when you're communicating, because you have that level of focus and understanding. So, I mean, I know that you write a lot, and
Yes.
communicating this deep understanding of wine, how does that all fit in the picture of being a sommelier?
Well, everyone in the wine industry, depending on what you do, is kind of looking at wine through a different window. And I mentioned hospitality and working in restaurants, and you're directly interacting with guests at the table. And so the onus is on you as the sommelier or the server to be able to communicate, to be able to talk about wine in a way that works for the guest, and being able to read them and very quickly figure out where they are in terms of knowledge about wine, but also their interest, whether they want to know something. At the same time, the most important thing, and I'm maybe going to quote the physicist Richard Feynman here, and I believe he was the one who said that if you can't explain something to an 8-year-old, you don't know what you're talking about. At least that was the gist of it. And that holds true for anything, but especially wine, because wine can be really complex. And so the onus again is on you as the sommeliers to be able to explain something to a guest at the table so they can appreciate it and understanding it without dumbing it down, but also without intimidating with them with what you know, and also just not telling them things they don't need to know. Because obviously the context for them is to have a great dining experience, to have a great meal. And so you then are the connector, and you really as a person don't matter. You're the one who's the vehicle to get them the right wine, serve it to them, and make sure they have a good time. So that background is really important to me, because my writing, if anything, and I'm sure a lot of writers share this, is that you write something and then it's always, when you're editing, is always making it as understandable as possible, making it simpler, right? I remember putting something I wrote through a software that I think assessed what level of education that you're writing for. And my writing came out in like 9th grade. And I was actually pleased with that, because then it meant it was understandable. And even the technical stuff where I could put it across in a way where people would get it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I write at that kind of level as well. And I think it's about having the ability to simplify these complex things down, so that somebody who is technically aware of the subject is able to see that you are an expert, but it's also accessible to people who are not as expert in the field. So I appreciate that. Let me ask you, is there any unique perspective that you have about wine that maybe other enthusiasts or experts don't have?
Well, I think the combination of music and then getting into the wine, and the combination of jobs that I've done in the wine industry make it unique. So just obviously restaurants, working for a winery directly, selling wine, marketing wine, and then working for the first online retailer for wine of any kind from 1996 to 2001. And at the time it was called Virtual Vineyards. It became the original wine.com. But I think Virtual Vineyards was the original e-tailer, because it opened in the summer of 1994. And so that whole experience of, again, that for me primarily was writing. But again, it was writing on the web, which was a complete frontier then, but it was trying to make, again, wine simplified and profiling, what a wine smelled and tastes like and what it would be like with food and all that, but really having to do it for the first time online so people could read it and get it. And so, it's not a unique skill set, but it's unusual in terms of wine.
I want to ask you a little bit more technical question. So as an educator in sommelier training, what are some key lessons that you emphasize to your students?
Well, my students are sommelier students, so by and large, not all the time, but most of the time. And so obviously I mentioned the hospitality angle of working on the floor and communicating with guests, but also, the fact that their service skills have to be automatic. They have to be polished. How they open a bottle of champagne, how they decant an older bottle of red wine, how they move around the table. It has to be graceful, it has to be elegant, but, they have to be almost invisible in terms of the server. And beyond that, the language, of course, the questions to ask, to get a good answer for a guest in terms of what kind of wine they're looking for. Beyond that, the theory mastery is, especially at the top level of our exams, it's really, really deep. And being able to, bring that up on command when you need it. And then finally, tasting, which is one of my specialties and something I kind of became obsessed with because in the beginning I was absolutely bad at it, really bad at it. And really passing the MS tasting exam was one of the most difficult exams I've done. And so having to figure it out and, written a book about it and continuing to coach about it, it's just, again, the sommelier is a unique skill set for wine. And so it's emphasizing those points, but the key points of, getting someone to where they have to be conscious of what they're doing to hopefully the goal of unconscious mastery, where it's, it's in the muscles and they can do it when they need to.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's this combination of performance and emotional intelligence in hosting, plus the deep technical knowledge and expertise, and plus the ability to taste and to understand the difference in the complexities. It sounds like it's quite a lot.
Well, it is. It's a unique skill set. The hospitality service part is the, kind of the ace that you don't find in any other aspect of the wine industry. And so there's a human element to it and an ability to communicate and some empathy and to, react with a guest. And that's really important because otherwise, what you're doing is what any other wine professional would do, which is primarily taste and then communicate about it, which could be writing or any other means.
One thing I like to ask people about is stories or memorable experiences. Is there a memorable experience or story that you can share from your sommelier career?
Sure. Many of them are reality checks because there are times where you're under the hallucination that you know everything, but you don't, you never will. There's too much to wine. But right after I passed the MS exam, and this was in 1992, I remember it was Saturday evening, early in the shift at the restaurant where I was working, and a four-top two couples came in. They were clearly friends, and they were having a great time. Apparently they hadn't seen each other in a while, so they were thrilled to be together, sharing a meal. And so I walked up and, had the wine list and said, I've got the list here, would happy to be help you make a selection for dinner. And one of the guys at the table took the list and he says, why don't you give us a few seconds to look at it? And I did. And when I came back, he handed me the list and says, we'll have such and such Old Vine Zinfandel. Okay. And I said, oh, that's great. So the wine he chose was a pretty robust wine. It was pretty tannic, right? Pretty astringent. And it was young. It had just been released. It needed to be aged. We only had it on the list because our prime directive from the owner was not to sell or anything, but to sell anything that we bought. Hence, it was on the list. And so I was curious and I said, oh, that's great. Great selection. What's everybody having for dinner? Because I wanted to make sure it worked. And so they said they were starting with a dozen oysters and a half shell, and then they were all having fish, right? So a really tannic red wine and fish don't work. They don't work for many people. It can work. Culturally, the Chinese, for instance, have no tolerance for too much tannin because they drink black tea from the time that they're infants, right? So, but most people, tannin in red wine, which for someone who doesn't know is like what makes coffee and tea taste bitter, right? Same thing. And if you pair it with, fish, which has umami, which is a taste sensation, which is really savory, but it's like train wreck in the mouth. And so my concern with them at the table was, that this wine was not going to work, and there had to be something else. We had lots of other wines, white wines especially, and I tried to gently to steer the guy away from the wine. And he said, no, 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 you don't understand. This is our favorite wine. This wine is impossible to find. And the fact that you have it is amazing. We have to have it. I said, okay. And so I went and I brought glassware to the table. I brought 2 decanters, and then I got the bottle, and I double decanted it, because one way you can make a wine open up is to get some air into it, literally. And so, because once you open wine and put it in a glass or whatever, it starts to oxidize immediately, even though that could take days, right? Especially with this red wine. But over time, it will help soften the wine on your palate. So long story short, I double decant the wine, I pour a taste. He says, oh, this is great. Pour it for the table right as the oysters show up. And they tuck in, and I'm standing across the room going, this can't be right. Yeah, this has got to be, it's got to taste bad, right? It would to me. But didn't happen. And so I walked back up to the table, checked in to say, oh, they said, this is fantastic. Please bring us another bottle, another half dozen oysters. And I did, opened it, decanted it, poured it. Their entree showed up. They had another bottle with dessert. And then they left, and the guy tipped me generously on the way out and said, that was the best meal we've had in I don't know when, and thank you so much for making a great evening. And I'm so glad you had this wine. And I was left stunned, thinking that couldn't possibly have happened to me. What do I really know? And so the lesson from all that is pretty simple, is that you need to give anyone permission to drink whatever wine they want to drink, right? And context trumps everything, because that was their favorite wine, and they would have had it with cheeseburgers, or they would have had it with Twinkies, or a Hershey bar, a Cadbury bar. They would have had it with anything because it was their favorite red wine. So, lesson and note to self. And that's where you, as the sommelier, you just need to back off, say, this is great, and take care of the guests.
That's a great story. And yeah, that's a good lesson. Sometimes we need to let people make their choices, and very, very interesting. I think that strikes me that it was the company and everything that was all part of that shared experience that they were having. And yeah, interesting. That's a great story. Okay, well, let me ask you about kind of more formalized events, wine tasting events. Can you tell me a little bit about how you think about wine tasting events and how organizers can set those up to make them better and to make them a great experience for people?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's kind of a multi-step thing, but I think the most important thing for the event planner is to find a good person who has a pretty lengthy career in the wine business, who's done different things, but also who's very knowledgeable, but who's above all is a good communicator and a good storyteller. Because regardless of the kind of client and the group, it's usually a dinner, but maybe just a tasting. The group really wants to be entertained, and they really don't generally want to know about technical things about wine. I mean, they do to a certain extent, but what they want to find out, they want to learn stories. They want to hear stories about the wines and the wineries. They want to hear stories about the person who's talking, how they came to wine and why wine is so important, and how they as a group or individuals can enjoy wine more. So, a corporate planner, that's what they're looking for, is someone who's a really good communicator, who can really connect with their group and can tell good stories, and who's really knowledgeable.
Yeah, and as a podcaster, I appreciate people who are able to tell a story and who understand the value of stories. So I can certainly appreciate that. Yeah. So then for wine education workshops, can you tell me a little bit what the difference is between a wine education workshop and a corporate tasting event? Can you tell me a little bit about what the difference would be and how you would approach those, and how you would do that?
Sure. Well, the education workshop is obviously going to be a deeper dive. So it's going to include more technical information. Certainly there's going to be tasting, because tasting always has to be involved. But you're trying to, you're putting up a set of dots and you're connecting them with the wines. So you're talking about probably a theme. And that theme could be anything from champagne. It could be dessert wines like sherry, port, or Madeira, or it could be any number of places in the world that are well-known wine regions, or not, maybe more obscure. And then you're talking about the background about the place, the region. Technically you're talking about soil types, you're talking about the vineyard in terms of how the clones of grapes that are grown, types of grapes that are grown, the trellising, sustainable practices, best winemakers in the area, what they're doing, recent vintages, how all these people are dealing with climate change. That's still a hot button and will be for a long time. And then you're tasting wines and you're connecting those dots. So that's an education workshop, and it's pretty information rich. At the same time, you as the teacher have got to make it doable. You have to make it understandable. As opposed to, a corporate tasting, you're not going nearly as deep. You're hitting the high points on the place, the grapes, styles of wine, but then you're talking about things like food pairing and what kind of regional cuisine and what people are eating and drinking and how that came about. And then also, for me, history of a place is really important. And I'm going to go deeper on that with, a corporate type event, because odds are, if it's a place like Tuscany or Champagne, or let's say Burgundy, odds are some of the people you're talking to, if they haven't already been there, they're going to go there, because hopefully you're going to pique their interest. They're going to taste some good wines that you've selected, and they're going to say, yeah, this place would be wonderful to go to, like Chianti Classico or Brunello di Montalcino in Tuscany. This is a place we have to go to. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine even, the different regions, different soil types, there's just so many different variations and details to learn about. Then talk to me a little bit about being a wine consultant. So how, what are your roles and responsibilities when you're a wine consultant? How does that work?
Well, it's, I've worked with a number of different clients over the years. They could be individual wineries. They could be consortios. I've worked for 4 or 5 consortios in Italy. Those are the regional governmental type organizations. And there's one for each major wine. Like there's a consortio for Chianti Classico or a consortio for Prosecco Superiore. And then regions have consortios too, like Alto Adige. They were my client for 7 or 8 years. And what you do for them is that you create training programs for industry professionals. So, and then you might even go to country with a group of people, with a group of sommeliers or whatever, and be the sommelier type liaison and work for the in-region people that are there. And then there's, I've done a lot of writing for clients for, the CIVC is Champagne, Wines of Germany, spirits houses, Cognac, Armagnac, malt whiskey. And then I've written big curriculums too. I did one actually in 2020 for the Wine Institute in California on California wine. And it was a massive curriculum on the history, on just California wine, but everything from history to viticulture to you name it. And it took me, that was almost a 3-year project. I wrote the original curriculum and then wrote about 30% of the actual text and worked with a group of other really amazing, MSs, MWs, and wine professionals to do it. And then finally, of course, I do special events and trainings for any number of different clients, including corporate clients, but also, I've done both consumer and professional trainings for wineries and for importers. So, a broad range of things.
Yeah, it's very broad in scope in terms of all of the different things that you're doing and different kind of facets to the business. Where do you see the wine industry heading? Like, what's coming down the line?
Well, the phrase, what is constantly changing will always partially remain the same, comes to mind. I mean, the cycle of whatever goes on in the wine business is that you have new places being not discovered, but new places coming online that are making, exciting wine. And for me right now, I think about places like Uruguay, Greece has been in the news for the last 15 years, even Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, places in Eastern Europe that have had wine industries, but the quality, either the infrastructure hasn't been there or the right people, and certainly the funding hasn't been there. But at the same time, you have lots of established places all over the globe where you have younger generations of winemakers who have worked all over the planet now. Because remember, the wine industry, you've got 2 harvests every year. In the Southern Hemisphere, you've got March, and then in the Northern Hemisphere, September into the fall. And so young winemakers now are working all over the planet. They're getting all this, hands-on experience and working with people in different parts of the world, and then coming back usually home or close to home in places like regions in Italy and southern France you've never heard of, in Spain and Portugal, and getting access to old vineyards, right? And then making really good wines. And that to me is exciting. That's really exciting. And that will always be exciting, and then of course you have, new directions like orange wine and natural wine. that are really curious and interesting to look at. So there's so much to the wine industry that is, it's constant renewal, but at the same time, there's new things. And it's almost impossible to keep up. I'll tell you that.
What is your personal favorite wine or region? Can you tell me a few of your favorites?
Yeah, there's not one. Yeah. I think everyone's palate undergoes an evolution where you start with one style of wine that you like a lot, which is usually white or pink and slightly sweet. And then all of a sudden you discover dry white wines and then red wines and robust red wines. And then all of a sudden things that are very elegant and nuanced and complex. And you go full circle at some point and you end up liking slightly sweet white wines again, as long as they have high acid and they're really well made, like Chenin Blanc and Riesling, right? So that's a long way to answer your question, is I don't really have a favorite kind of wine because I like practically everything if it's really well made. That said, I do have wines I like to drink. And for white wine, German Riesling, I mentioned earlier, in any style, from slightly sweet to dry to really lusciously sweet. I think Riesling is a very transparent grape in that it really shows the place where it was grown as well or better than any grape. For red wine, I love Pinot Noir, red Burgundy. Unfortunately, a lot of it unaffordable, but I love Italian red wines. So especially Sangiovese, I mentioned Brunello di Montalcino, but also Chianti Classico, I think is the most improved red wine in Italy over the last 25 years because of all the work they've done. Barolo and Barbaresco in Piedmont from the Nebbiolo grape. But, Italy, if I have to choose one country, would be the one where I'd spend the rest of my life eating and drinking because you could just never get to anything. And just, the food is incredible and the wines too. That is not to say I wouldn't spend time in France because I certainly would, and other places. Italian red wines. Also, just a shout out before we go, on this topic is Assyrtiko from Greece for white wine. I just think is phenomenal and delicious. I would just say as a closing little clause to answer your question, people like me who've been in the business for a long time, the wine for us has to be two things. It has to be delicious, so the delicious factor still has to be there, but at the same time, place matters. And so we tend to like wines made from domains from a place or vineyard or region. And the wines really show, the term is terroir, but it's a sense of earth and mineral that you get from very unique place. And the place, the soil, and the yeast population and then the microflora and fauna really affects fermentation, and that's what you're talking about. When something is unique, is that stamp of a place in fermentation that ends up in the wine. So that's a long answer to your question. Sorry.
That's okay. One of the things I love about doing these podcasts is you get to talk to super interesting people who are deep experts in a topic, and you can hear the passion coming through in your voice about this. So I love that. Who is an ideal client for you? If somebody out there is the perfect person or organization to work with you, who is that, and what can you help them with?
Well, I don't know if there is a perfect client, but there's certainly a lot of clients who want to put on events for their employees or the people that they serve. And they want the event to be memorable, and they want people to take away something from it, but really having enjoyed it. And so, finding the right person who puts an event together that really entertains but educates just enough and makes it light but makes it fun. And so that's, what I try to offer to any client is, to do an event, to put something together, is that in the end goal, to make it memorable, to make it fun, to make it light, and then with wine, to make it enjoyable, right?
Tim, your book is Message in the Bottle, a guide to tasting wine. And where can people find you if they want to learn more?
They can find me through my website, timgaiser.com, and certainly they can buy the book through there, or they can buy the book directly on Amazon.
Awesome. And I will have links to all of that in the show notes. Tim Gaiser, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, Alastair, thanks so much for having me. It's been fun to talk to you, and it's been a pleasure.
If you're interested in this, you might also be interested in my long-form podcast, which is called The Recognized Authority. Episodes for that typically run about 45 to 55 minutes, and I go a little bit more in-depth with experts about the topic of building authority, personal branding, content creation, high-ticket sales and marketing for B2B expertise-based businesses. So if you want to check that out, look for The Recognized Authority in your podcast app. Thanks for listening.